Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Molly Cook with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University, and I will be helping out with technology on today's webinar. Today's topic is WIOA Title I Program Exits, Rules on Exiting Your Participants. As a reminder, all participants on this call are in listen-only mode and cannot unmute themselves. If you have questions as the webinar proceeds, please post your questions in the Q&A or chat box, and we will address them at the end of this webinar. A reminder that this webinar will be recorded. The presentation recording and any materials presented during today's webinar will be available on the Illinois Workforce Academy website and on the Illinois WorkNet website within 48 hours of today's session. In an effort to be as accessible as possible, this webinar will be offering closed captioning and live transcription, so feel free to turn this on using your Zoom toolbar. Tomorrow, each attendee will receive a follow-up email, which will include a survey asking you about today's webinar. Please provide feedback and any suggestions you have to help improve our upcoming webinars. A reminder that if you have a faulty internet connection or would prefer to call in, you can do so by calling into this webinar using the phone number in your original registration email. With that, I want to go ahead and turn it over to our presenters. Oh, I'm sorry, I have a poll as well, I forgot. So we have two polls to kick us off and get us started. The first is, what is your local area? And you should see that poll pop up right now. All right, I'll give it about 5 more seconds. Okay, so it looks like we have pretty good representation from throughout the state. Almost, yeah, that's very balanced. So that's great. Welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you here. And I realized I was not sharing my results as I was talking. So there are the results. Okay, we're going to do the next poll now, which is, what is your role in the WIOA system? So you should see that poll right now. Give you about 30 seconds to answer that. Okay, you should be able to see the results on the screen now. If you selected any of the other roles or your role isn't listed here, please go ahead and verify for us what your role would be in the chat box, just so that we know, and that would be really helpful. So now, with all of that, I'd like to turn it over to our presenters, Mark and Paula.
Thank you, Molly. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us. This is our, I think, 7th now webinar in our performance series, Title I performance specifically. This will be our last overview session. We do have some other topics that we'll be discussing and presenting in the coming months as we identify appropriate dates. We'll let everyone know, and the ICSPS team from Illinois State University will be including those in those weekly announcements. So please keep an eye on those as the coming weeks and months come up. Today's session, as Molly said, is on program exit, but we will be touching quite a bit on follow-ups too, because we feel it's important that all of you understand the kind of the dividing line between receiving active services, career services, and follow-up services, as we've been looking at all of our files over the years and see sometimes we see some discrepancies there. So we want to make sure we cover that. As always, I want to thank my team, our team here at the Office of Employment and Training at Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Patty Schnorrs, our manager of the Performance Technology Unit. I am the performance manager, and then Paul is our, as I continue to say, our resident expert. She's been working in the performance field here with OET for the last 15 or so years. So she's always our go-to girl to get clarification on any of the performance-based ideas. As I mentioned, we'll be talking mostly about program exits. We want to touch on the 90-day exit rule and exceptions to that. We want to know how program exits impact performance measures and reporting. And we also want to touch on ensuring that you get the knowledge you need to better enable programs to remain in compliance. As I mentioned, as we do reviews of files, as our monitors do reviews of files over the years, we have been seeing some areas of concern as far as exits not complying with the guidance that DOL's provided us, as well as state policy. So we want to cover some of the areas that we've seen over those years and try to get everyone up to speed on an understanding when exits need to occur. We will touch again quite a bit on follow-up services that occur after exit generally. And then we want to make sure, as we've been doing throughout this entire series, we want to make sure to give you a couple examples or scenarios so you can work through, while we're here on the line, some files, customer files and dates, and try to select the appropriate answer. And then we'll give you the responses and reasoning for those. So we'll get right into that now. Appreciate everyone putting their location and where they're from as far as a partner or provider. Gives us a good understanding of who's on the call today. I did notice quite a few of you are career planners. That's great to see. Again, I think you'll find a lot of worthwhile information here today. We do have, as I mentioned, we do have guidance and the act to follow. So here are some of the references you should be familiar with related to performance in general, but they also touch on program exits and on follow-up services, starting from the act on down to the final regulations, which are kind of sister guidance that the Department of Labor and Department of Education put out. We also get policy guidance through training employment guidance letters, or TEGLs, and TENS, training and employment notices. And then we have our own state policies that we issue on a regular basis through our policy unit that all of you need to comply with. And then always want to remember that locally, all of your local boards are able to develop their own policies, so you should be familiar with those. Here are a little bit more specifics. If you've got the downloaded PowerPoint today or later, these should be links, so it'll direct you to some of those, the most important ones being these two TEGLs here, 1016 and 1418, that really talks about performance and the measures and goes over program exits, follow-up services, and then the exceptions that apply at certain times. And then finally, some of the guidance. This is the Workforce GPS is a very helpful website. Department of Labor is the kind of the overseer of that. They provide webinars on a routine basis, sometimes in conflict with our webinars because they hold them some Wednesday afternoons as well. But you should be logged into that or signed up to that and receive their routine notices so that you can join their webinars as well. The three policies listed down here in chapters 3, 4, and 7 provide, for the most part, all the guidance you'll need to understand program exits and follow-up services. And we include career planning because it's so closely tied to when you need to understand the exits and follow-ups occurring. Finally, we're talking today only about Title I, although some of the concepts and requirements around program exits and follow-up services do apply to the other programs. We're representing only Title I today. We do anticipate in the future that we'll be collaborating with our other 3 core partners to provide some similar performance-related webinars on a more global basis, so that everyone can understand how we all work together, how everything interacts, how we can be a better, more integrated system. So today, if you're not from Title I think you'll still gain a lot of information. I don't think that you're needing to jump off because it isn't you're not Title I focused. Just be aware that there might be some intricacies to the information we give that are Title I specific. So you'll want to check with your partners, your program directors and administrators to make sure what your rules are around these topics. Because of the program exit, we aren't going to get into systems specifically on how you make program exits in any of the 3 systems listed here. We will be holding webinars in the future on that as well. Also, Jim Potts, who's in our office as well, conducts routine training locally, either virtually or he's been starting to go out as some of our restrictions around COVID have been lightened. He's been actually going out to our local sites and conducting training. So he provides a very good overview of systems around eligibility and other areas. So we're not going to spend our time today looking at the systems, but you should be aware that we do have 3 systems, depending on what your grant or funding source is, would dictate which system you would be using. The Illinois Workforce Development System is the official system for Illinois. Everything we report to the Department of Labor has to go through the IWDS system. These other 2 systems listed here would feed into IWDS. So if you're in LWIS 7, you're using the Career Connect system through the Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership. All of their information is fed into IWDS so that we can then submit data to DOL, as I mentioned. And then some of our new grants, I know some of you joining today are probably with the Youth Career Pathways Grant. We appreciate you joining us over these last few weeks and webinars. You might be using the Illinois WorkNet system. Apprenticeship programs are using the Illinois WorkNet system, or more commonly called now the Illinois Workforce Integration System, that tracks some of these specific and special grants. So just know as you are conducting your activities and services, which system is the appropriate one for you to use, and become familiar with that. Let us know if you have any questions on systems. We'll direct you to the right resources for each of these 3. We'll go into several terms and definitions. If you've been following with our other webinars, some of these are going to be repetitive, so we apologize, but we do want to make sure these are also considered standalone webinars. So someone that's specifically looking at program exits and follow-up can come directly here and get the information they need without having to review all of the other webinars, although we do always recommend you continue to use those as resources as you conduct your day-to-day activities. So reportable individuals and participants are our 2 kind of categories of customers. Individual customers, I should say. We always have kind of conflicting information on what a customer is, because we have individuals, we have businesses, we have partners that, depending on who you're talking to, might consider them all customers. So the individual, it can be grouped either in the reportable individual or the participant level, and the difference there being the level of services received. If they're only receiving self-services, conducting their own kind of research, or getting minimal information from a career planner in one of our resource centers, or virtually, where it's information only, then the individual would be considered a reportable individual. If they seek further services where considerable input and working with a career planner, case manager, whatever your term is locally, then we have to determine eligibility, and other requirements come along to ensure that we comply with enrolling them as a participant. So it's really the service level and eligibility determination that dictates the difference, for the most part, between a reportable individual and participant. And then our youth participants, we have two levels of youth participants: in school youth and out of school youth, and each of those come with their own different requirements in some areas of performance. So you'll want to become familiar with those. And the other difference is at least one of these services, the 14 youth services, have to be provided in addition to development of an individual service strategy to be considered a youth participant. Very key to performance in general, but the main topic of today's discussion is a program exit. So program exit occurs when the last service or identifies the date of the last active service, but we don't necessarily know when that date is until 90 days later, because you need to let time elapse according to the guidance we've been provided to ensure that it actually is the last service received. And we'll go into that in more detail. We always throw in common exit. Eventually, Illinois will be integrated where we have systems that talk to each other. And so we can exit each other based on other services being provided by other programs. Right now, we do this internally through the Dislocated Worker and Trade Adjustment Assistance Acts, we can do common exit simply because we work closely with them in the same office and use the same system. But it's difficult to do common exit across all programs at this time. But in future years, we will do that. But that is simply exiting them when they've received their last service from any partner, not just Title I partners. Period of participation, again, is key to the measurable skill gains. If you've joined us on that webinar, you'll understand why that is key. It's exit based, and the period of participation is basically the date of enrollment to the exit date. Even though we know there'll be some follow-up services after that, the period of participation ends when program exit occurs. And then finally, we'll speak more on follow-up services. These are designed to help somebody in the 12 months after they've exited the program to ensure they continue to stay in unsubsidized employment, get the help they need to maybe further their career in that occupation that they were thankfully employed in after exit, and after training and other services were provided. So we'll go into that in more detail. And then finally, the last few items are just some terms related to exits. An exiter is the individual that is being exited, and we use that when we do calculations of performance. Certain of the performance measures, as we'll talk about later, Paul will talk about, but we've talked about numerous times in our previous webinars, they're exit based. So we know an outcome when we have an exit occurring, and those include the exit employment second quarter after exit for the adult and dislocated worker, as an example, over fourth quarter after exit. Exit quarters are dependent on their program year exit quarters, but when we're doing performance, we have to be cognizant of when quarters are occurring, because they're tied to the exit, not to the calendar year. And that's where sometimes people get confused. You know, if you're looking at a calendar, the first quarter is January through March, but if someone exits in a different quarter, then that would be the third quarter, and then the first quarter of the next year would be your second quarter after exit. We'll show you a little bit of a timeline with one of our scenarios, so you can see that a little bit better. But it's very critical to know when the exit quarter is, to understand when performance gets applied. And then finally, the last term or definition here are just post-exit and post-exit quarter. Kind of what I just said is we got to know when these exits are occurring. What are the 3-month periods as far as exit quarters that we're looking at. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Paula. We'll jump right into the program exit information. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Yes, so like Mark explained, today is going to be all about program exits. And our main goal is just to give everyone a good understanding of the concept of a program exit and why it's so important to help everyone remain in compliance with exiting their participants. Because historically, something that seems like a straightforward process or record in the system, there's some things that need to be understood about them. So the concept of a program exit is basically just when one of your participants is no longer really being served by you, and it's time for them to leave or exit the WIOA program. Maybe someone else can actually be served. They don't really need your services anymore. The exit from a program is often, not always, triggered by someone completing their training that you were funding, completing all their career services, and then they might transition into employment. They really don't need our program anymore. As far as significant staff involvement, or if you just lose contact, someone may leave and just become non-responsive, as we all know. Then the second most important thing about WIOA program exits is the reporting factor, how they tie in with reporting. They directly relate to performance measure reporting. If a participant is not exited in accordance with policy, systems and programs are not able to report their outcomes in accordance with WIOA. Exits exit dates that fall in an exit quarter trigger starting the clock on reporting their performance outcomes. An exit record, this is something else. So there's the date of exit. An exit record is actually the mechanism that LWIAs, career planners, use to document the fact that they're exiting them into a system of record. So that's the mechanism, that's like the data entry. And then there's the concept of when a program exit of a participant ending their service should occur. So a couple different concepts or things that go hand in hand with exits. Next slide, please. As always, Mark and I have designed, in our work group, has designed these PowerPoints full of many rules and quotes straight out of our TGLs, training and employment guidance letters, and policies. And that's important because these PowerPoints are designed to serve as a point of reference for anyone walking in brand new, people who have been around. So moving forward, I'm not going to read all of these definitions that we take straight out of the TGL. It's more what we aim to do with many of these slides is just to break down the concept. So you can always know you have the TGL to go to and these definitions that I will not read all of them, but we want to break it down and explain it so it's easier for everyone to understand and then comply with. But as far as program exit is defined, guidance would state, WIOA guidance would state that an exit must occur when a participant has not received any active services funded by the program or a partner program for 90 consecutive calendar days, and they have no gap in service scheduled, and they are not scheduled for future services, which would be documented IEP or ISS. So at that point, when you've determined that, the date of exit is actually applied retroactively to their last date of service. So whenever an exit, the mechanism is used to submit an exit record, you do not enter the date. The date is applied retroactively to when your person got their last service, the date of their last service. Then we would always want to point out that we're looking at active program services. We'll go into this later. And it's provided to a participant that has taken place within the last 90 consecutive days, like career services, for example. Active program services would not necessarily include determination of eligibility, self-services, follow-up services, or just simple documentation of case notes, a call or check-in, or if you just want to document a fiscal record or simple notes like that. Those are not active services, and they will not equal the exit date once the record has been entered. Next slide, please. And this is just reiterating that once you know a participant has not had any services and they don't have any more planned, you must enter the exit record in your system of record. On top of this, since it's a WIOA law when to exit someone, because if you're not exiting them, you're not reporting them, and it's a double non-compliance issue technically. So programs are reviewed for exit compliance, and there's many ways you can check yourselves on this, and we can review them. Programs may be cited when staff is not exiting participants in compliant with the 90-day exit rule. So if you have your participants on the books and you're really not providing them services that require a lot of your time or significant involvement or really helping them, and you haven't pulled the trigger and exited them out of your program, that's non-compliance. And significant staff involvement and enrollment in service always indicates that a participant is being actively served. So when you think of an active service, it means there's some engagement there that's time consuming and takes work on programs' capabilities and their times and their funding this person. Leaving telephone messages or emails or entering just standard case notes into the system of record is not considered an active service that would extend someone's participation or require you to keep them enrolled in the program and then delay their exit date or delay reporting. Next slide, please. On top of the 90-day exit rule that we'll talk about, career planners also should not enter exit records, record the exit in the system until 90 days have passed with no active service. So the exit record must be entered no more than 120 days from the last date of active program service. Is this a bit confusing? It is. The reason for this is that if you say someone, you provide them their last career service, this is an example, or their last training service. If you went into your system, Career Connect or IWDS, respectively, and submitted that exit, well, truly, they have 90 days that you might realize they need something else. They need another service. So the IEP or the ISS might contain a planned date of exit that might be today. However, that does not mean you actually submit the exit. While that action, that record in the system needs to be timely, should not be the date that you're planning their actual exit date, their last date of service. So you have to wait 90 days and then the system will know their last date of service and it will go back retroactive. So however, since we have the 90-day exit rule, you cannot just wait too far past the 90 days. If you go more than 120 days, because we do build in like about 30 days of some data lag there, we know that, you know, you're watching these people. Not all the career planners are doing these exits themselves. So we give you about 30 days to manually go in and, you know, use the mechanism in the system, tell the system you're exiting the person. So that's a built-in data lag. The one implication, which I'm sure almost all of you are aware of, if for some reason you have not recorded the exit in the system, you're locked out. At that point, there's various reasons, it would be deemed non-compliant since they weren't exited after they're within 90 days of their last service. So at that point, you would request me, Paula, to exit them, or Mark. And at that point, they're subject to our review. Sometimes, you know, when we have the record, we'll go in and look, sometimes, for example, to make sure that their last date of service was actually an active service. You can compare those to case notes and other things. So when you're not in compliant with these, and there can be different situations, different levels of non-compliance, and the amount of records that you have to request us to review and exit, that is one ramification of not keeping on track of your 90-day exit rules, exiting participants. Next slide, please. So two slides back, or one slide back, we said, you know, you need to wait 90 days to submit the exit in the system in case they come in for another service. Well, there are reasons that you would go ahead and submit the data entry, the exit record. And they're mostly like those other exit reasons. If you know they're going to be institutionalized, incarcerated, if they're deceased, if they have a reason for medical that you know is going to go way longer than 90 days, and that's documented, well, of course, you would go ahead and submit the exit. It wouldn't make sense to keep them in the program just waiting that 90 days. And there are other case-by-case situations too. In the event that you have entered an exit record, though, that you've deemed necessary, it's made sense, but the person does come back in and by mistake or intentionally you have entered that record, you would have to request either Mark or myself to go in and just simply remove that exit from the system so you can continue to serve them. You probably contact your manager if you're a career planner so they can request that from us. Once you exit a record, and this is just mostly procedural, even local admin staff, I don't believe no one has the ability to remove an exit record, because at that point, like I said, it's a compliance issue with reporting. And in the career planning in the future, we will go into some decision paths about and processes and when it's time, when it's right to determine that someone is going to be exited. Next slide, please. Okay, there are some exceptions to these rules. The 90-day exit rule, which is you have to exit someone if you haven't served them and don't plan to serve them in 90 days. It doesn't apply in instances where someone has a planned or future gap in services of more than 90 days. These are usually very extenuating circumstances. If you can document a delay in the beginning, before the beginning of training, but this is only a 180-day allowable lapse for this. So like we discussed the other day, if you have someone today and you know they can't get their training till September, well, would you just hold them in the program all that time? Probably not. If there's a health or medical condition, an extenuating circumstance, a personal issue that can be documented and would make sense, and it would be prudent to keep that person in the program rather than exiting them and making them come back, that could be an exception to the exit rule. And like I said, the plan gap in those services may not last longer than 180 consecutive calendar days from their most recent active service date. And then all of these plan gaps must be documented in the IEP or ISS in the system of record by case notes. They should truly be updated as you learn new statuses for the participation's re-engagement into the program. Like this, for example, I think I just saw something pop up, and we're not answering questions now, but if you know of the service holding in our system, it is designed as a placeholder. If you ever identify someone that has one of these outlying situations where you've deemed it necessary to keep them in the program while they're not being served, you may record a holding service. But please know that if you have someone who isn't being served and all you have is a holding service to remind you of their situation, they are still going to be reported as no service in 90 days. So technically, they're going to be on your 90 days no active service report. So that person, they're compliant because you've deemed this necessary and you're documenting it, but technically they're going to show up on your reports indicating they're not being served, because they're not. So just please keep that in mind if ever you are making the decision to place someone in holding without exiting them. Next slide, please. So there's a such thing called common exit. It doesn't necessarily apply to us with the exception of our dislocated worker and trade programs. When they're co-enrolled, that's co-enrollment. That's in Title 1418 and it mentions this. States may implement common exit policies, and this indicates that a program exit should only occur when the criteria of a program exit is met for multiple core programs. That's more TEGL language that we kind of like to break down. In this case, Illinois does not have a common exit policy, but grantees should utilize principles of the definition if a participant is enrolled in multiple Title I-B programs, such as youth and adults. It's already applied for, like I said, dislocated worker and trade, special grants co-enrolled with LWIAs. The system will require you to pick an exit reason for both programs, and there will be one exit date, a common exit. You'll actually be forced to exit them at the same time. So all your services need to be closed out in both programs for that exit record to be allowed. Next slide, please. So this slide is basically just to touch on local reporting requirements and how they tie in with rules for exiting. So participant engagement is key for determining when one of your participants is being actively served or maybe can't be advantaged by any of these WIOA Title I services in your program. And there's rules around this for reporting, and services, activities, and case notes, credentials must be recorded in the system of record within 10 days, within 10 days of taking place, happening, learning about it. They need to be kept current. And then program exits, they're in accordance with the 90-day rule. No service in 90 days, about 3 months, they need to be exited from the program and move on. Outcomes recorded like supplemental employment, education, or training need to be recorded in the system of record within 10 days of learning of the outcome. When I'm talking about those outcomes, those probably are, you'll learn about employment when someone's participating. There's also things you learn about that are recorded after you exit them, but that's talking about employment during participation. Grant recipients need to report on performance indicators or goals in accordance with their grant agreements. So all services, activities, and case notes also need to be recorded by the grantee to ensure accurate performance reporting. This includes annual eligible training provider information like ETPL information, annual certification reports. We haven't had those active for a few years, and then any submission of participant, employer, and other local success stories. So point here is that data should be recorded in the system of record sooner than later. This just, to me, validates this data. It keeps it more accurate. If you think about it, the sooner something is recorded, the more accurate it is. You would have your validation and verification in the file and more available. So that's just typical reporting requirements, and a lot of those are outlined in the career planning policy as well. Next slide, please. This slide, I will not read it, but it is goes along with local reporting requirements, and it's kind of an exit cheat sheet, a list, a checklist to go over, because like I said a few slides back, once you submit an exit record in the system of record, many things can be updated after you do that, but not everything can. So it's just best to get the file, like review your file, add anything that needs to be added that was known, even if you were late on a service or missed an episode. Things like that should definitely be reviewed and checked and recorded always before you exit them, especially with services and things like that and end dates, because you wouldn't be able to update that without requesting assistance from me or Mark to remove the exit record or re-exit them. So please always refer to this. Prior to entering an exit record, this is all the following information that should be reviewed for accuracy or deficiencies and should be corrected. It's not too late to correct your records at this point. And always case note, and then it's covered in the event of a monitoring. So you want to make sure, like I said, services are key, all supporting documentation, employment records, job records, work history, all the credentials should be added correctly based on what type of credentials they are. Measurable skills gains are important, and those can always be verified. The exit record, that's the mechanism of submitting the exit. You'll be required to pick a school status at exit and exit reason, and there should be supporting documentation in the files to back up those reasons that you pick, especially at exit when you are exiting your client with one of those reasons that exclude them from any performance measure reporting. So they're not going to hit any of your performance measures. There are exclusions to those. However, since you're completely removing them from performance reporting, they need to be well documented and validated in the system. And then note, a separate exit reason is required for each cone rolled program. Would probably be the same if you ask me, but there are instances where a trade customer might have a different exit reason on their trade. exit than their dislocated worker. Next slide, please, for example. So this is another reference that I won't read through, but these are exit reasons in Illinois Workforce Development System. There might be others depending on the program and the system of record that you're using, but it's exit reasons like they attain their credential or diploma, their GED, they're attending post-secondary school. If you cannot locate them, deceased is another reason they wouldn't be reported in performance. If they went on to enter a registered apprenticeship, if they're in supplemental employment, where we're not going to get the wage upload at that time, entered unsubsidized employment, and that is typically the goal for exiting your participants, especially adult and dislocated worker, entered unsubsidized employment. Foster care for youth is an exclusion. Health or medical is an exclusion, as well as institutionalized or incarcerated. And the other services completed or not complete are sometimes when you can locate the person you're talking to, and for one reason or another, they didn't attain any of the goals that were, maybe if they didn't attain anything in their IEP or ISS, you might want to consider one of those exit reasons. Reserve forces called to active duty, that is an exclusionary reason. So they're listed together in the system. Reporting to the federal government, we only report a date of exit. These exit reasons are specific to our state for tracking and reporting reasons. Next slide, please. This slide is regarding what I'm talking about for exclusions from performance measures, or as we report it, it's called other, in quotes, other reasons for exit. And they're just like I said, incarceration, medical treatment, a participant is deceased, or as a member of the National Guard and was called back to active duty, and for youth only if they're in the foster care system and they exit because they have to move from the local area as part of that system. You would specifically document that in the exit record and in the file, and they will not be included in your performance calculations for any measure. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just an example of how we are tracking compliance with our 90-day no active service exit rule, and different examples that I think might be confusing when you're looking at the true exit date, which is their last significant staff involvement, or something that should just be documented as a standard general case note. Isn't something so active that it's going to extend their exit date, so, or should be documented as a service in the first place. And right now, well, actually, that will be the next slide, I'm sorry. I talked about how you can stay compliant. We have reports and tools that are designed specifically for tracking your participants to make sure you're always in compliance. And we even have a countdown in the iPad's dashboard built in online. So we have you can see their last active service is greater than 60 days. Their last active service is greater than 90 days, which means the clock is ticking to the point where you're going to be locked out, or 110 days. And so we're looking at their last active service, because once they have a last active service and they've gone a lapse of time, especially that 90 days, and you have not recorded another significant career planning staff involved service, they didn't go back to training, they're not getting any support services, you need to be looking at submitting that exit record before it's too late. Then on the dashboard, we also note there's a field for participants with services open for more than 6 months. This isn't necessarily a non-compliant issue or indicator, but it's something you might want to look at. Not all services are appropriate to be open for 6 months. So what if you just forgot to put an end date on a service? This could potentially leave them off of your performance reporting forever, unless you had a report like this to see everyone with an open service. things do happen when you're busy. You might have forgot to end a last date of service, and then you're not going to have them on your days with no service for the 90-day exit rule report. And then there's more to come on the IPATS dashboard in regards to accountability and compliance data. In the IWDS reporting menu, as most of you probably know, there's a report, and it's the same concept. It's designed to track the same thing as the last active service greater than, but it's called the days since last active service report. And when you run it for 111 days, you will be provided with a list of all of the participants who have not had an active service recorded in 90 days. At that point, it's a red flag and you need to review them. If for some reason there was a real active service provided and just not recorded in time, that needs to happen, or they need to be exited. The exit needs to be recorded in the system as soon as possible, because once you pass that 120 days, you'll have to ask Mark or me. Next slide, please. Once again, and this is what I was referring to a minute ago, the 90 days with no active service rule, employment, it has to be significant staff involvement. So when we look at this, an employment verification of someone. So you just go in and look at via IBIZ. This is not an active service. This should never be recorded as an episode, and it wouldn't equate to their exit date. You would enter, like I said, you would enter a case note and not an episode within a career service. Something like employment verification should not extend participation and exit date, since it's not a significant staff involvement, directly placing person in employment or some type of other training. You're not even necessarily adding or planning or updating their IEP or ISS at that point. But an active service, for example, if you are providing an individualized assistance for someone who, or you're actively matching up your participant with existing job openings, employers, and they're related to you're looking at their past job experience and the occupational training they had in the program, all their career services and their IEP to actively match them with an employer and an occupation. That is an active service. That's referred to employment replacement, which is staff assisted. So that might be their last exit date. And this is just to illustrate how different an active service is than something like employment verification. So next slide, please.
All right, thanks, Paula. We're going to stop here before we move into follow-up services. We're going to stop here and take some of the questions that have been posed in the chat pod. Got quite a few of them. I've tried to respond to a couple of the easier ones in the chat pod that don't really probably require much conversation. I do have a couple people I noticed in the participant list that have raised their hand. I don't know if they're looking to ask questions, but we do ask that you put them in the chat pod at this time. If we have time at the end, we may open up phone lines, but typically we've not had enough time near the end of these to open up phone lines. So we're trying to use the chat pod as our source of gaining questions. So hopefully if the two of you still have your question, please put it in the chat pod. Our first question comes from Teresa, and it got me thinking about conversations we had, our working group planning for today's webinar, and the exact question, we had quite a conversation on it. Hers is, if the exit date is retroactive, how do we avoid being out of compliance with follow-up services? So she says first quarter requires contact once per month following exit. So, you know, we like I said, we had a conversation on that yesterday, and you'll even see more so, I think, when we start talking about follow-up services. Yes, we have guidance from DOL that we need to comply with, but it seems like there's, I don't want to necessarily say it's conflicting, but it seems like things just don't flow in the manner, the language that we see in the act, or we see specifically in the Tegels. So the best we can do for you is just keep in mind all of the concepts around program exits, follow-up, and active services, and that, and do your best, especially follow whatever your local policy is. Some of our work group indicate, their local policy requires them to do certain things. And so we respect that until we otherwise review and deem that not acceptable. We will accept that. But basically, what you're doing, and a lot of the questions I've seen in this chat pod is based around good strategic career planning. And what I mean by that is, as you're working with your customers, you should be forward thinking enough, not necessarily know that what's going to happen every 90-day period of time to know that, okay, now I know I've kind of got my last active service. I'm waiting for the 90-day clock to end so I can enter their program exit. But you are really trying to predict in discussions with them what services they're going to need to get to the end goal, which for many, in many instances, is employment. That's on the active services side of a program exit. Follow-up is what occurs after they've kind of got employed, and we'll talk about under follow-up, but it's maintaining employment and how they can better their employment and get better wages and things of that nature. So you kind of got to understand where that kind of dividing line is between active career services and follow-up services. And yes, there might be instances where you think someone is done with all their active services, so you go ahead and start the follow-up services because they came and became employed before that 90-day period. And we do understand there's going to be instances where your plan changes. And in those instances, if you've already done the program exit, as Paula mentioned many times, you'll just have to reach out to us. Your program manager will have to reach out to us, let us know why that is. But if you're not doing a good job of planning and understanding all these services, and we see a significant number of requests to delete or remove an exit because something changed, we're going to probably start wondering why this is occurring on a routine basis. It really shouldn't be a regular occurrence that we see people are having to backtrack kind of from their services. But if you, as Paula said in some of her slides, if you are planned that there's no more services going to occur, then there are exceptions to exit them before that 90-day period is up. I guess is the end comment I make there is, while we want you to wait 90 days, it's really, and the Act says you should wait 90 days. We do understand the exceptions, but you should also, be very cognizant of the implications if you exit somebody and then they come back for additional services, especially if you've already started follow-up services. So the best we can do is just say, do your best as a career planner, follow your local policies, try to abide by the 90 days as best you can while you're waiting for that period of time to elapse. And just again, do your best that you're not exiting them and contributing to the potential that we're going to have to backtrack on that exit because some other services come up. Next question was about the 110 and the 120 day policy. Current policy is that you have to physically exit them in the system 120 days, at least before 120 days from that last active career service. As Paula showed on the iPads, Illinois Performance and Transparency System, or Accountability and Transparency System, we use 110 days there because it's a career planning tool. It helps you identify, if you go in here routinely, at least once a week, you're going to know that somebody's approaching the 120 days. So if they're showing up on that 110, you need to exit them immediately so you don't reach that 120 days and then cause, again, another request from OET, Paul or I, to have to address that. So we're just giving you a little bit of leeway, a little bit of guidance, warning that it's time to exit these individuals that are in that report. Once they reach the 90, if you're looking at this on a weekly basis for your customers, your participants, once they hit the 90 days, you can go ahead and start. So you should really never get to that 110 days. But we do understand holidays, weekends, all that with calendar days that you might need to wait. You're going to have a few days of wait to actually enter those into the system. Another individual enrolling, I think Paula addressed this holding service. If there's a plan gap, and Paula, correct, they use that holding service if they know they have a plan gap of less than 180 days. I responded to that part of the slide. If they're going to go beyond 180 days, then you need to exit them and then re-enroll them when those new services are going to start. And the reason of that is a lot can change in a 6-month period of time. And so we need to find out if anything from their characteristics have changed. Maybe they're no longer even eligible for the program. That's probably going to be very rare. But with that much distance in between, you just need to be understanding that we shouldn't be having gaps of 6 months or more. I don't know if you want to add to that, Paula. Okay.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. That's all I would say. If it's going to be over, I think you said like in that time frame seemed awfully long. You would have to exit them and re-enroll. There was a question up the list, Mark. From Aisha regarding definitions of all those exit reasons.
Okay, let me, as we scroll down, I've got a few before that, so we'll get to that one.
You do? Okay, I thought you went over. I'm sorry, there's so many.
Yeah, no, we've got another one. What if the participant is a wanted fugitive and not responding? So that's kind of one of your exceptions to know. If they're not incarcerated, we can't use the exclusion. That's pretty clear. If they're out on the loose and you're trying to track them down, obviously this is a unique situation that doesn't occur much. I don't know if this is. I assume it's an actual instance since it's in here, not just somebody what ifing a potential. But once you can't have contact, you can't plan for any more services, then you would exit that individual. Now follow-up services would follow. Yes, we have a requirement, especially if it's a youth, that they have to be given follow-up services for a year after exit. And for adults and dislocated, it's a shall or a should, meaning you should probably plan on a year's worth of follow-up services. Again, we'll get to that in the second half here. But if you can't make contact with that individual, that's a reason why you can end follow-up services. So we'll touch on that a little bit more in the presentation. We had someone say that at 90 days, we have to stop this as a funder, I guess a grantee, not one of our Title I administrative grantees, says they can't allow participants going over 90 days. Well, again, think of the program exit rules here. So you're supposed to go 90 days without service to know that you've reached the program exit date. You have to be allowed time to do that. So if your internal process says on that 90th day you have to exit them, we can't control what your internal process is. Our systems have allowed leeway to better case manage files. We know nobody's going to be able to go on every 90th day and exit these customers. So the best I can say is the program director needs to be made aware that there's certain rules that have to be complied with, and then 90 days is one that we with certain exceptions we can't relax. And if we need to speak with them, have them contact Paul or I to discuss this. I imagine it's just one of those where they know what the rule is and they just want to make sure they never exceed it. But we also want to make sure we are case managing well, and we're not overwhelming our career planners and case managers by trying to get something done that might be more trouble, I guess is a easy way of saying it than it's worth as far as that local policy. So don't want to really speak to what the local policy or the programmatic policy is, but we do have some rules we have to comply with, and without an exception jumping in, you need to wait till that 90 days to exit them. We've got another one. If someone moves after exit, as in the military, and is best stationed out of the state or country, will we still need to follow up? So the exclusion reasons we've covered multiple times in these webinars, that is the exit reason. If the incident occurs after program exit, it's no longer an exclusion from performance. So if they join the military, they get stationed after exit, get sent overseas, and it's occurring again after exit, it's not the reason the exit is occurring, then yes, follow-up services should be applied, but knowing that in that given year, if you're not going to be able to make contact with them, that's a reason to potentially say we can't do follow-up. We don't want you to unnecessarily try to contact someone every week for a year, year and a half that they're stationed overseas trying to get follow-up services. We understand that's a burden, as well as WIOA understands that. So in that instance, yes, you should be providing follow-up services, but if you're unable to provide them because there's no ability to contact them, then you're able to use that as reason to stop the follow-up services. Again, we'll touch on that a little bit later on. So I'm hearing Aisha's question: are there definitions for the list of exit reasons? I'll let Paula, if you want to go ahead and judge that or respond to that, because you're more familiar with the services matrix and all that, where all these definitions are housed.
Okay, and so now there are so many questions, I lost it. And I was typing in the chat with what you just said regarding the military and no provision of follow-up. As long as it's justified and documented clearly in an IEP or ISS, those reasons would always be justified at that point. And then military also would count as employment if you documented it post-exit, but for performance purposes. So the list of definitions for those exit reasons has never been, we don't have a clear definition. They've always just been known. And I had statements regarding to each one, but when you said other services not complete is a negative exit, it's the connotation of that is negative because the program, they didn't get all their services completed or their goals completed in the program. They didn't meet everything they set out to do or you wanted to do with them or help them with. However, it doesn't necessarily indicate they're going to be negative in all performance outcomes. So, but yes, if you want to send me an email, I can send out a list of what each exit reason is selected to mean. But just keep in mind that, yeah, performance is not.
Sorry about that, Paula. Let's try to answer a couple more, and then I want to jump into the follow-up, and then we'll come back to questions if we have time later, but I want to make sure we cover the material we have here. But I do want to ask, I see David and Olivia from Illinois WorkNet. One of these questions is there notification given in IPATs of upcoming deadlines? And I can't remember. So if you wouldn't mind just putting in the chat if there's ability to schedule, kind of some kind of notifications or something, if you wouldn't mind respond to that. Otherwise, we'll respond to any of these questions that we aren't able to get to. We're documenting as part of recording the webinar. We will respond to them, and since we probably were going to have quite a few questions left that we aren't addressing, we'll put together a Q&A to send out to everyone that's registered, and then you can share those. We'll make sure we get information out on each of these questions. But we're going to go ahead and jump into the follow-up services, and we'll come back to these last, I think, 3 or 4 that we haven't addressed. I know there's one about a trade. We're just going to have to look at that. If the reason isn't there for a trade client, maybe they can use the dislocated worker because they're going to be co-enrolled in that. But if not, we can look into our system staff and see if we can add that as a reason. We just have to check with trade to see if that's it would seem like a legitimate reason, but trade has its own rules in that, and we got to make sure we are complying with whatever their rules are as far as exits and reasons and things of that nature. So we can, we'll look into that one as well. But Paul, I'll go ahead and turn it back to you for follow-up.
Okay, so WIOA follow-up services, and we're limited on time, so please just use these slides as a reference. Anything that's taken right out of Teagle's and it's like rules and definitions, and from that guidance I won't read, but you have it here. So the main concepts is they're critical, that are their services provided to ensure an ongoing success in their employment placement or post-secondary education and training, or follow up to any of the goals that they established and set out to achieve based on their participation in the WIOA program, and all 3 programs. And follow up a lot like active services, but they're not enrolled necessarily. It's still interactive two-way communication between the participant and the case manager, career planner, that occur during a 12-month period following program exit or starting upon realization of an adult's employment, entry into employment. They should occur as often as necessary, but at a minimum, they should occur at least once every 30 days for the first 3 months and then at least once each quarter for the remainder of the 12-month period, so up to 12 months after exit. Next slide, please. So this is more for determining the 90-day rule, but because the date is retroactive, their exit date, follow-up services may begin immediately following their anticipated last date of service, even though you're not manually entering that record. You're pretty much doing follow-up because they're on their way to exit. You have a planned, conceptualized, determined exit date in their IEP or ISS based on everything they've done. They've completed it, they've reached their goals, and they can be entered in the system of record as follow-up. Next slide, please. Again, just leaving messages with no response, they're not considered a follow-up service that is probably not providing much benefit. You're not finding out anything. The career planners need to work in conjunction with the participants always to identify what follow services may be needed. There's all different levels of intensity depending on what their goals were. I mean, just career, if they were in a lot of occupational training and work-based learning and set out to do all these other things, they might be a lot more in depth. Next slide, please. Follow-up services differ for the different programs. So adult and dislocated workers, the main rule is follow-up must be provided to them for up to 12 months when they enter unsubsidized employment. You should consider providing follow-up for adult and dislocated workers to make sure they're on track, but it's not a requirement. For youth, follow-up must be provided at program exit for youth. So all youth are required follow-up services. And this list, please use it as a reference if you ever have a question about what is allowable, because there's different things that are allowed during follow-up for the different programs. Next slide, please. So some rules for discontinuing, like we talked about in the chat, so I won't cover a lot of it. If they're completely unresponsive, can't be located, they're refusing to provide information, they moved out of the country, they can be closed. As long as it's in the IEP, it can be validated, it makes sense, and they'll trust your decision for discontinuing those, especially if it's a waste of your time when they want no contact with you. Same for youth, but they may be discontinued if they're unable to be located and they request clearly to opt out of services at any time. Local policies must be developed to outline when follow-up services are appropriate, when they should be provided, in the process for discontinuing services for youth, since they're required at all levels. So next slide, please. For dislocated workers and adults, they need to be given follow-up at time of entry of unsubsidized employment. Generally, they would occur after program exit, but if you determine someone's in employment and you're just waiting to use the mechanism to put the exit in the system, but you pretty much know their exit date, follow-up services may be recorded in the system and even as case notes. Next slide, please. And then when we talk about exit-based performance measures and follow-up, so as we know, the date of exit triggers all performance reporting. So you have your exit quarter, and then we start looking at your post-exit quarter. All the quarters after that, there's follow-up. I mean, there's follow-up and there are performance measures tied to each of them, and that's why we call them exit-based. This is when follow-up is essential, and they are for adult and dislocated worker who are just in supplemental employment in their second and fourth quarter after exit. The only way you're going to know about their supplemental employment, because we don't get a wage match or upload, is through your follow-up with them. The credential attainment rate, if you exit someone just maybe in employment, but maybe they just have their high school diploma. If you can't verify, or you're not sure they're meeting those credential outcomes, if they just have their high school diploma, you need to figure out during follow-up if they actually get their credential. They have a whole year, and that's in follow-up. And then the special rule for people who just have a high school diploma. So you have all of these methods and ways to increase your performance, because you're pretty much required to follow up anyway with youth. So outcomes identified and documented in system of record during follow-up are directly related to performance measure reporting and success. I think this is adult and dislocated worker again, and this just names the measures. And then next slide, please. For Title I youth measures, it's extremely important. Follow-up is essential for the employment or education and training rate in the fourth, second, and fourth quarter after exit. Since more than employment count for youth, follow-up is going to be the only way we will ever figure out if they're in education or training that gives them that positive outcome, as well as their supplemental wages. And then for that credential attainment rate, again, since you have a whole year after exit to earn and document a credential, your participants earn them, you document them. For that positive, follow-up is very important there. That special rule again applies to youth. And the only way you're going to figure out the condition to meet that special rule is during their follow-up up to a year after exit. Next slide, please. Okay, and I'll turn it over to Mark so he can hopefully cover our two scenarios.
Thanks again, Paula. We wanted to make sure we covered a little bit of follow-up. As I mentioned in the chat pod, we have had some monitoring findings where we've had career planners considering follow-up services as actually career services, and we need to make sure we're differentiating between career services which occur leading up to whatever their end goal is, whether that be employment generally, or in some instances, maybe post-secondary education or training, versus what a follow-up service, and I'm going to slide back to that 32 real quick. You know, just be mindful of the purpose of follow-up services. It's helping to retain employment, earn wage gains, advance in the occupation or workplace, or if you're youth on the other side here, you're continuing lifelong learning or achieving self-sufficiency. So these are after the fact. Now that you've reached your goal, we want to make you continue to be successful, and that's a follow-up services. And while it might seem similar to something that is given as a career service, we really need to make that defined line so that we are having program exits occurring at the appropriate time. So be mindful of this list, be mindful of career services matrix. I know Laura, Dom, our policy manager, and Paul have been working diligently with others on the service matrix. We hope to have that out formally in policy in the near future. You know, just be mindful that we can't extend exit because we're giving follow-up services just because we don't want to consider them follow-up services. If they're follow-up services, they're follow-up services, and we need to react accordingly. So we're going to try to cover a couple of the scenarios. I think I've responded to all the questions in the chat as Paula was presenting their own follow-ups, except for one, which was if there are multiple individuals in a case file, who owns the file? And I'm going to let Paula respond to that, because I don't know the answer other than to say I think that's a local decision as to who has control of it. But ultimately, the administrator kind of has control of what gets entered and sent to us for us to report on. So I'll let Paula answer that one real quick.
Okay, I saw that earlier and I wasn't sure what that meant, but where is that question? Who asked that question? I just wanted to read it again.
Christine Liskey. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing the name wrong. Christine Liskey. So up just before, I don't know, 1:45 or something, it came up. Yeah, 1:50 p.m. if you're looking at your time log. I'll go ahead and go into let me go ahead and move
please,
into the.
I'll read this and answer it in the chat.
Yeah,
if I
yeah.
can.
Okay, and we'll have one moment afterwards. We're going to try to cover 2 of the scenarios, and there is a third scenario we're not going to get to, but we'll cover these 2. We did send these out when we were originally scheduled to present this several weeks ago, and then the weather got to everyone, and we had to cancel and reschedule. We sent these first 2 scenarios out to everyone, but this first one we actually revised a little bit. So if you had that in front of you, we added a couple services and as a result changed dates just to kind of be a little bit clearer. So we give you Heidi here who has quite a few different services, and the key here is to figure out which ones are career services, which ones affect program exit, and which are not. So, you know, we see all these dates. There's a lot of different supportive services in addition to career services. And as you go down the list, just kind of in your mind, think which of the following 5 answers is appropriate. Is the program exit, should it occur October 5th, December 1st, January 5th, February 1st, or do we even know what the program exit date is? So hopefully you've been able to take a look at these, kind of quickly glance at the service list here. Some of these aren't even career services, so you've got to keep that in mind, and that's where we try to show a realistic example of what a case file might look like. And not everything's a service, not everything's a career service, not everything's staff assisted. So we tried to identify things of that nature. We'll move on to the response, or Molly, if you want to throw it up real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put up the poll.
Yeah, well, I just give you a few seconds to respond to this one. Now that you've had a chance to look at it, just select which of the responses you think is appropriate of those 4 dates, or if you don't know it, you can determine that at this point in time. Got a few responses from all areas. Primarily, people are thinking February 1st, which is they begin in employment. Quite a few on the December 1st date, which when you go back to the systems is a staff assisted employment referral and placement. So that's certainly a career service. And then quite a few, the majority of you actually are responding E. We don't know yet. And so that is actually the correct answer, because think of what we've said over the program exit. You got to go 90 days without, with minimal exceptions before you know. So if you look back at this list of services, while we might think the last actual service given was received transportation assistance on January 5th, we are only at February 23rd. We have not reached the 90-day period. They may come back in and ask for more services. Just because they became employed, employment is not a service. Employment does not automatically indicate program exit. And we see that at times where people think employment is automatically going to be your program exit date at your last service. Well, getting employed is not a service. Paula had a slide earlier where she specifically mentioned staff assistant employment referral or something. That's a service. Employment, being employed, is not. So you can't work off this February 1st date, which quite a few of you chose as the program exit date. Again, even if that was the appropriate choice eventually to be a program exit date, we really don't know any of that until 90 days has elapsed. So we got to keep our minds open to a potential additional assistance needed. And so January 5th in that list is the last date we know of a career service occurring. We start our 90-day exit clock. Some of the guidance we've read elsewhere uses that term, exit clock, and you kind of wait, although you should be in contact to make sure everything's going well. Just because you contact them doesn't mean you have another service. If you're just saying, hey, everything going okay, you're looking for a job, yeah, okay, well, that's not providing any assistance. So we still stick with that January 5th date. And in fact, in our system, they did have a couple other things. So they received an interview. They had a payment of cash incentive. Those aren't staff assisted. Those aren't career services. So none of those extend the program exit date. So in summary, we really don't know that date on today's date. If we're thinking about it on February 23rd, we don't know the date. The exit clock would say it's looking backwards at January 5th, But we've got another probably 45 or whatever, however many more days we have before we truly know that they're not coming back for services and the 90 days has expired. Now we can exit them retroactive to January 5th. With those exceptions, if you're knowing they started a job and they said, folks, I'm done. I got my job. That's what I came here for. I really don't want you to call me anymore. I don't need any follow-up services. You know, in your mind, you know that they're done. Then maybe you exit them before that 90 days has elapsed. But again, use that very, very infrequently. Don't make that a common practice because you're going to get burned by it in the long run with someone coming back. Just because they started a job doesn't mean they might not come back and ask for additional assistance that would be categorized potentially as a career service and extend that program exit date. So that's our first scenario. Second scenario is Jordan here, another list of services. Same kind of summary. Can we identify a date? And this is going back quite a bit further, so you might be able to identify a date. That's why we didn't say in this instance that we don't know yet. You know, he hasn't received anything, done anything in our system for a period of about 6 months now. So it's a little bit easier, or 5 months, I guess, at this point. So you look at his list of services. Which of these 5 dates do you think is the appropriate date to put down as a program exit? And this program exit should have occurred prior to February 23rd because the 90th day would have elapsed. Your 30-day period of recording the service has also elapsed. So potentially elapsed. Don't have a calendar in front of me, but if it had, then you should know and have already recorded it. And a majority of you are picking the last date, September 23rd, tied to this employment counseling with Title I-B career planner. Some of you are picking the date July 13th, going all the way back to employment offer. A few of you are picking a couple of these other dates. And actually, we're missing one of these dates. So the program exit, the 5th answer, the 6th answer isn't here, I don't think. And I can't read these because of the way this is set up. The last one, oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the old one. So yeah, thanks, Molly. So use this one again real quickly. Identify which date you think is the appropriate program exit date. Now that we know 90 days has elapsed and we got to put it in the system. And thanks, Eric, for reminding us that we had to put that poll up. So majority of you are picking September 23rd, which does, again, relate to the employment counseling with Title I-B career planner. A few of you are picking the other dates, but only a handful of all of those dates. We'll move on to the response, and the response is actually C. The program exit date would be April 14th because that's the last active career service. Remember, we're looking for career services, not follow-up services. So if we look at this list, we already know from the last scenario, job interviews are not a career service. Getting an employment offer is not a career service. Beginning employment is not a career service. Checking in just to see how things are going would not be a career services, nor would employment counseling. Those are follow-up services. So the program exit should be based on a career service, and we go backwards and we find out that the date of the program exit was actually that April 14th date where we gave them some job search assistance. So that's why I said, make sure you understand the difference between career services and follow-up services, because we don't want to use follow-up services to extend our exit. And it looks, unfortunately, in this case, like a lot of you thought employment counseling would have been the career service that at this point in time would have given them their last date to tie the program exit to. So that's what we're trying to be clear in our guidance here today, and especially that slide 32 of what a follow-up service is, in addition to what the services types are, where we give you a list of what you might see as consider a follow-up service. So, keep that in mind. It does go back to some monitoring findings we've had where those kind of follow-up services, those decisions are not the correct decision. You can't base your program exit on a follow-up service. So September 1, September 23 should not be a date you're looking at, even though those look like services of some nature. UI, some more explanation like we always like to do with these scenarios is just give you a little bit more basis of what we have information wise, so you can play this out in your mind and kind of maybe tie it to a client you've had in the past and go, oh, now I understand how I should have handled that. And you know, not to say we're not pulling out any of those instances we saw inappropriate. We would follow up in those directly, but not in today's session. Didn't want to call any specific one out, but you know, you should be mindful of that. Understand what these are, what is not considered a WIOA service, what is, what's follow-up, what's not, and what's considered a career service. So in addition to these two scenarios, what we did, so if you've downloaded the PowerPoint, you'll see a third. Oh, let's do this first. So if we just look at a timeline, it looks a little busy, but this is in your mind how you follow this through. And what I've done is identified career services, staff assisted with a green font, self-services or information only services. And look at those. Some of those are occurring after career services, but again, they're not extending our program date. Follow-up services are in purple. Those don't extend our program date. So in reality, this individual's period of participation was very short, less than a month. Up here at the top, you'll see the 3/16 to 4/14. That's really the enrollment date to the last date of service. That's all it was. Starting on 4/14, we have a program exit. We can do some follow-up, even though other services may have occurred after that date. They were follow-up or they were self-service. They were not tied to a career service. And then in the orange over here, we're just showing that there's a year period of time that you should be considering follow-up services for a dislocated worker, which in this instance, Jordan is. You know, we'd like to give follow-up services for a year, but there are exceptions to end those. If it's a youth, you have to give follow-up services for a full year, unless you just can't find them, or they've firmly said, I don't want any follow-up services. We give those two exceptions in policy, so you'll want to be familiar with that. But in general, you should be giving follow-up services, and truthfully, that's really part of your career planning to ensure that they succeed once they are employed or once they have gone into further education or training. You know, don't think of it just because they got a job, you know, you feel like you're done with them. These follow-up services, as Paul has mentioned, very important to successful performance in some instances, but really success of the individual in their career, not just employment. We're not here just to get somebody a job. We're here to get them on their way to a good career that'll lead to self-sufficiency, all those things that we've talked about in the past. So good timeline here. Look at that and kind of build something like this in your own career planning and case file. We've had a couple more questions. I'm going to see if we can do them real quick. I don't know, Paul, so in the first instance, wouldn't it be 90 days after the last career service? That's not the program exit date. That's when you would determine what the program exit date was. Your program exit isn't 90 days after last service. It's the date, again, where you look back and your exit clock ends and you say, okay, no services were provided since April 14th. So in that one scenario, the exit date is April 14th, even though you may not enter it in the system or even identify it until after July 13th as a date. Yes, Paula.
So remember, I'm just saying, so the career service, like that's the service. The date you go in and use that mechanism to do your data entry is not the date of exit. It's going to go back. So that's the hard part, but just always remember, and it's usually planned or documented in the IEP or ISS. That's how you go that 90-day lapse, always looking back. So, and those reports are instrumental and essential in helping you track this. Otherwise, it makes it very difficult. So just remember that the reports are available to show you the last date of service.
Yeah. And then another question is, how can they exit someone before they began employment? Remember, employment itself is not a career service. Generally, there may be instances where you've provided a service in conjunction with their employment date. If that's the case, it's the career service you provided in conjunction with that employment that dictates the program exit date. But if you wait your 90 days after, so let's say, you know, April 1st is my last career service. I get employed on May 1st. I got to wait till July 1st, just rough numbers. I know that's not exactly 90 days, but July 1st becomes my 90-day period. Now I can go back to that April 1st and know that that was my last career service. The fact that they got employed in that 90-day period doesn't change the fact of when the last career service occurred. So your program exit would occur before employment. And it could, it could occur after, potentially, in rare instances. Going back to the first scenario, adult dislocated work cannot be offered supportive services while. So we did have in our work group yesterday, I think this is one of those where internally you have to handle this. So the question is, can you provide supportive services during follow-up? And no, you can't provide supportive services during follow-up. IWDS also is not set up to count supportive services as a service activity, resetting the exit clock, but it should, or not, or Paula, correct me here, is a supportive services, is that where
So I'm keeping up with my questions. So for youth, if it's in local policy and planned in the ISS that they might require supportive service after exit is the only time it would be allowed. Supportive services are considered an active type of career service. So for adult and dislocated worker, if it was in the IEP and they needed some transportation after you helped them get a job, and that just happened to be the last real service they had, that may be their exit date. It may be their last date of services. All that happened after that was you provided a job placement and then provided a supportive service, again, like transportation to get to their job. They called and said, it's going great, I don't need anything else. The date would go back to that last supportive service. In theory, it's not always their last service, but it may be. It's just the difference between employment being their last service. Like I said in that one slide, if you're providing significant involvement, like you were going over all of their work experience, the training they took, working with the employer, looking at different jobs, and then that service, it's a same day service, you reported it, which you should if you're doing all that with them, that might be their last date of service. Just them kind of, you talk to them once a month and they say, hey, I happen to get a job over here randomly, that verification would not be their last date of service. So employment, may you exit them without employment? It's usually not a best practice. You would like to know they were employed before you let them go. You always want to be able to help them get, even if you're not actively placing them, you may do other things that develop their employability skills and all of those types of career services that's leading them to employment. So no, it's not the reason for exit, but many times it's a circumstance that leads you to determine their exit date. So sorry, I know exits are hard. They're not hard. It's just up to a lot of internal decisions and it's case by case. So I know we're over time, and maybe Mark, you can remind them of our upcoming spring webinar that we're going to try to clarify a lot of this gray area with exits and the roundtable.
Yeah, so let's move on. We got through this. I want to mention again, and we'll certainly address any other questions you're putting in the chat pod before we close out our session today. But we do have a third scenario. This is kind of take-home assignment, if you will. Camille here has her plan laid out, all of the services and that. And what we did with this one is a little bit different in that we gave you, I think, 6 different questions to respond to. So look through the responses. Here's, first question, what is the program exit record in the system of record for Camille? What date? Then we give you an explanation why we've done for all these. So there's 6 different things you can find out from this one scenario. And a couple of reasons we did this, just to give you a little bit more to think about from each of the scenarios, this one specifically. but it's also leading up to, as Paula mentioned, we've got two more upcoming events to occur. I'm going to go ahead and scroll through all these. So please print out or download the PowerPoint today and take a look at all those scenarios. If you have questions, email Paul and I. But our next scheduled upcoming event is actually kind of a closed session. It's a virtual roundtable. In order to keep this directed at the right folks around program exits, we are going to be sending out an email to our program directors and performance staff. We'd like to really have only 2 people identified from each local area to keep it to a manageable number, indicated as the ones that will be registering for this event. We'll come together, we'll have a little bit of a plenary session to explain what's going on. We'll go through a couple scenarios in a youth setting, a couple scenarios in adult and dislocated worker setting. And you'll do those on, we're gonna have probably 4 breakout groups. So you'll be assigned to one of the breakout groups. We'll wanna know if your focus is on youth or if it's on adult dislocated worker, or do you work with all 3 populations? So that we can break everyone out in the appropriate area. But we wanna keep these to a manageable number so the conversation, it can be a verbal conversation, not a chat pod kind of conversation if we had 200 people joining it. So we'll be sending that out to our administrators and performance people to identify who should be attending this and which session they need to, or breakout they need to be in. We apologize that we can't have everyone on that session, but the intent is to get those people in most local areas. Actual exits don't occur at the career planning level. They happen at a higher level in the structure. So that's why we want to reach out to those folks. But we also are going to, we're in the conversation to potentially hold what we'll call office hours or open sessions on a quarterly basis, where we'll put those on the calendar in advance and we'll be able to just have open conversation. What's of your concern of that day? We'll have you send these questions in advance. And that way we can come together for a couple hours, possibly, if we think we need that much time to address all those, so everyone learns from everyone else's concerns and gets a consistent message. And we'll also look at performance in general. How are you doing it, across the board as a state, all of the 22 local areas in meeting negotiated goals? Is there something we need to talk about that maybe, quite a few local areas are struggling with to get better performance? So we'll use it for 3 different reasons, but we'll get those on the calendar, get those sent out once we can identify the appropriate time, and then try to do those on a quarterly basis. So at that point, we probably will open it up to a much larger audience, but it will be focused really at the higher level, more than likely. So we'll share that once we get to that point. And again, if you have any questions, we'll put together something with all a Q&A with the remaining questions we weren't able to address today. Please email Paula or myself directly with your questions. Sorry about some of the questions we didn't get to, but also sorry about some of the, I don't want to say conflicting information, but certainly some of the ways of addressing some of the program exits where you can't wait 90 days or should you, or what exceptions are out there. We understand the day-to-day life of career planning and dealing with participant files versus what's kind of written on paper that maybe isn't really operationalized or able to be operationalized or procedure, in procedures. But also be mindful of your local policies. Always follow those in instances where you might have questions. Take your question up to your performance manager, your Title I administrator. They can forward it on to us. If they can't come up with the right through all of your policies, can't come up with an answer, we'll be more than happy to respond. So appreciate all your time. I'm going to turn it back to Molly for last housekeeping items. Appreciate joining us, and thank you, Molly, as well. Thanks, Paula.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you everyone for attending today. As I stated earlier, I'm going to be getting a follow-up survey out to you, and you'll get an email tomorrow with that follow-up survey. If you could provide us with feedback and suggestions, it really helps with our upcoming webinars. So just look for that tomorrow along with the recording. And we just thank you so much for joining and hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.